So the Gorton and Denton by-election happened yesterday. The results came in this morning, and despite it being a Labour stronghold, it was the Green Party that came out victorious there. So what's your initial reaction to the results from that by-election?
Well, I mean, to put it bluntly, it's a catastrophic result for Labour. Just absolutely diabolical. You can't really dress it up either way. This is a seat the party had held since, I think, 1931. Certainly pre-war, certainly in anyone's lifetime, no one can recall Labour losing in Greater Manchester. You know, they obviously have a very popular local mayor in Andy Burnham, who was now infamously blocked from standing in the seat. That now looks like it was a dreadful call by the party. But, you know, he didn't run, and the candidate that did run finished a very poor third. So for Labour, you know, no way dressing this up. It's diabolical. On the other hand, for the Greens, you know, they've never won a by-election before. You know, they've never polled more than 10% in a by-election before. They'd never won a seat in the north of England before. So a real sea change, I think, this result. In terms of Scotland, the obvious thing is Anas Sarwar, who's a Scottish leader of Labour. He, just a few weeks ago, had called for Keir Starmer to resign as Prime Minister. And he didn't specifically mention this by-election going on in Gorton. But, you know, that was the kind of unspoken message. Because today, Scottish Labour are holding a one-day event in Paisley, just outside Glasgow. And that's meant to be a sort of pre-election rally. We've got the Holyrood election coming down the line. The campaign for that will start at the end of March. And it was meant to be sort of geeing up Scottish Labour members and saying, right, we're ready for the fight. We're going to take it to the SNP, etc., etc. But obviously they were looking at the calendar and they saw that this by-election in Gorton fell one day before their big do in Paisley. And I think that it wasn't the only reason, but I think that was one of the reasons that they took a decision to distance themselves from Keir Starmer. So Anas Sarwar stood up and said, he is a distraction from what Labour are trying to do in Scotland. You know, we're trying to unseat the SNP, but all anyone wants to talk about in the doorsteps is how much they dislike the Prime Minister. Whether that strategy works remains to be seen. We'll find out on May 7th when the Holyrood election takes place. But for now, you know, whether he likes it or not, it's another day for Anas Sarwar where all anyone will talk about is Keir Starmer and how badly Labour is doing at a UK level.
Mhm. Absolutely. And so you mentioned there about how big a stronghold it is for the Labour Party and how big a stronghold, like how important this seat was for Labour. So how worried do you think that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party will be at a national level at the result of what happened yesterday?
I mean, if they're not worried, they should be, because we already know that they can lose ground to the right in the form of Nigel Farage and Reform UK. So they last year won in Rochdale, and that was an extremely close result. You know, Reform only won by 6 votes. But I think if that by-election was to happen again tomorrow, I think Reform would have, you know, increased their majority quite substantially, because Labour's popularity and the Prime Minister's popularity have only nosedived further in that time. So they kind of they really face an existential crisis, really, Labour. I mean, because the strategy was to kind of hold the centre ground and take on Reform on the right, and now they've also have to take on the Greens from the left, and they can't really face both ways, you know, at the same time. So they're really going to have to pick a side. You know, which is a bigger problem for them? I mean, it's not an easy question to answer. They still have a lot of time between now and the next general election. You know, which a lot of things can happen, but right now it's probably going to happen about 2028, 2029. So they've got time on their side. But it looks pretty clear that unless there's a change in the leadership at a minimum, I don't really see the situation improving for Labour. So it's really up to the parliamentary party at Westminster, the Labour MPs. Are they going to tolerate Keir Starmer for much longer? There seems to be this acceptance that we'll keep him in the job for now, Come May, we've got elections in Scotland, we've got elections in Wales, we've also got council elections across England. And unless the polls are drastically wrong, I mean, it's going to be an absolutely awful, awful night for them. We could see them lose power in Wales the first time ever since the devolution started in the late 90s. I mean, that almost looks a racing certainty that they're going to have a truly woeful result in Wales. In Scotland, they could, they're currently in third place. That's where they were in 2021, the last time there was a Scottish election. But they've spent the last 5 years working very, very hard to try and, they thought maybe there was a realistic chance they could take power in Scotland. And that seems a very remote possibility now. So all that combined, will that be enough to bring down Keir Starmer? I mean, if it isn't, I don't know what it will take, but right now they're in a pretty bad place, and where they go from here, that's not up to me. But it's a lot of better paid and clever individuals in London will be currently asking themselves that question.
And Labour weren't the only party to lose out. Of course, there were multiple losers in this by-election, but one of the parties that went big in Gorton and Denton were Reform. They had bit high hopes of stealing this seat as well. They were all over it in terms of campaigning, and they put in a really big effort to do it. So, what do you think the feeling will be within Reform and with Nigel Farage after losing to the Greens in this by-election?
I think obviously they'll be disappointed. I mean, I've not been on the ground in Gorton, so I haven't been first-hand reporting on this. I think what they'll look at, though, is they'll look at this and think, well, it's a suburban seat in a big northern city. That wasn't always going to be the most easiest place for a party like Reform to win. They obviously won in Rochdale, which isn't a million miles away. But, they were looking at more other Labour strongholds. And, for example, places like the Northeast, like Durham, Northumbria, that kind of neck of the woods. But if Reform are, going to form a government, and that's what they claim that they're the government in waiting. That's how Nigel Farage should certainly present themselves. If they are going to do that, then they really need to be winning in places like Manchester. And right now, it doesn't seem like the kind of very, we've got quite a diverse electorate in a place like Gorton. I believe it's about 30% voters are Muslim, for example. And I think they went, certainly from what I've seen, I haven't seen, detailed polling, but it looks like they kind of broke quite heavily for the Greens. We can debate why that is. But, then there's also a very educated, electorate in the sense of graduates. I think there's quite a high number of graduates living in Gorton and roundabout that have maybe moved out because the housing's cheaper than in central Manchester, where infamously it's extremely expensive. So Reform maybe have to ask themselves, well, why isn't our message resonating with these people? And one thing I would venture, in my own opinion, is that we've obviously seen recently Reform unveil a number of former Conservative cabinet members, like people like Suella Braverman, people like Robert Jenrick. And Farage's idea is he's like, well, look, I've got my cabinet in waiting. I've got these people with experience in government. They would be ready to do the job from day one. But on the other hand, it's fair to say people like Robert Jenrick are very, very divisive and, not to put too fine a point of it, pretty unpopular with a lot of voters. And maybe if you were a floating voter who's pretty hacked off with Labour, maybe you voted Conservative before, but you don't particularly like them after 13 years of government. If you had previously viewed Reform as, well, there's something different, at least, they haven't made a mess of things before, you now see these former senior Tories coming in, and you might think, well, it's just basically the Conservative Party under a different name. It's a Conservative Party under Nigel Farage. That isn't really what I want to vote for. Whether that played a factor in Gorton, I don't know. But I mean, I think, Farage has already come out, and I know I hate to kind of get into this kind of stuff, but we've always seen the word sectarian being thrown around in Gorton, and I don't really want to get into the detail of that, but I think that's what they'll chalk it up as. They'll say, well, look, there's a hostile electorate who didn't like Reform, and we need to worry about that later. I do think they're going to have to, like, go after the Greens a bit more, because the Greens have kind of come through the middle here. I mean, they haven't been, they're not an unknown quantity. The Greens, obviously, their new leader, Zach Polanski, is a very popular man, getting a lot of media attention. But maybe, bashing Labour just won't cut it for Reform anymore. Maybe they're going to have to, bash the Greens as well. Will that make any difference to them? I'm not sure. I mean, I think the Greens are probably quite glad when Farage has a go, because obviously the people that are voting Greens probably not a very high opinion of Nigel Farage at all.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So if we're looking at things from the perspective of a Scottish voter, so obviously we've mentioned about the upcoming Holyrood elections and that sort of thing. So obviously this has got to have an impact on what's going on in Scotland as well. So what do you think people in Scotland will have learned from this election? Do you think this will influence how people think about the parties or how they think about this upcoming election in any way?
I think it'll probably just reaffirm what most voters in Scotland previously thought. And number one, that is that Keir Starmer is a busted flush and is right now dragging the Labour Party down. If we go back to this time 2 years ago in 2024, before we had the UK general election, Labour was going up in the polls in Scotland. It didn't quite reach a stage where it had overtaken the SNP, but they were getting quite close. So we were looking at Labour polling in the sort of high 20s, low 30s. Now, we're looking at Labour like they're not even hitting 20% of the vote. And there was quite a major poll came out this week, a sort of MRP poll, as they're called, which kind of breaks down constituencies. And that suggested that Labour could have as few as 15 MSPs. Meanwhile, the SNP would be on, I think it was 67, which would crucially be enough for a majority. Now, I was in the Scottish Parliament yesterday, and people from various parties were playing down this poll, saying that it doesn't reflect the reality of individual constituency battles. I mean, obviously, that's what politicians would say. They never like polls unless they're the ones on top. But however you want to look at it, right now, Labour is in a very precarious position in Scotland, and things like last night don't help, because they just continue the narrative of Labour losing, Labour can't catch a break, Keir Starmer's making a mess of everything. And Anas Sarwar, I think, fully understands that. That's one of the reasons I think that he made his speech 3 weeks ago where he called for Starmer to quit, because he's trying to talk about what Scottish Labour can offer voters in Scotland. But the problem is, I think too few people are listening. They're talking about, well, what about Labour in London? What are they doing? And what's Keir Starmer doing? And this is what activists and Labour members are hearing from members of the public on the doorstep. Labour want to talk about in Scotland, well, we would fix the NHS by doing this. We would boost house building by doing this. But voters just aren't listening to them, and that's a pretty major problem. On the flip side, for the SNP, they don't really need to do anything. They just have to stand back and watch Labour play this out. The SNP are riding high in the polls. John Swinney just has to kind of keep the ship on a steady course. And right now, it looks like that'll be enough to win. They don't have to say anything particularly radical. They just have to kind of gently remind voters of, well, we have been in power in Scotland a very long time, but look at what Labour are doing. Labour are making a mess of things down south, aren't they? And I think a lot of voters are agreeing, going, you're right, they are. And they might not necessarily vote SNP as a result, but they might not vote Labour. And that kind of leads you to, well, you've got, the situation in Scotland, which really benefits the SNP, obviously, is if you are very pro-independence minded, you are very likely to vote SNP. However, if you maybe you don't like the SNP for whatever reason, or you have a very firm view of, I want Scotland to remain in the UK, you have multiple parties competing for that vote. So it leads to fragmented opposition to the SNP, and it's God's gift to them. I mean, they wouldn't admit it publicly, but Reform has been a huge gift to the SNP because it's fragmented the pro-UK vote even further. I mean, Reform have been pulling votes from all parties, to a lesser extent the SNP than others, but they've been pulling votes from Labour, been pulling votes from the Tories, and weakening them substantially as a result. And it just gives the SNP a huge, clear path to victory. And unless, I don't know what it takes to change it, but right now it looks like John Swinney will be First Minister again come May 8th. And the SNP will be pushing forward to their third decade in power, which is quite incredible.
Absolutely, and just finally, of course, we've got to mention about the Greens and talk about them a little bit. Of course, it's a massive achievement for them to win this by-election in Gorton and Denton. But what do you think it means in Scotland? Do you think it could do anything to help the Scottish Greens?
I think the Greens absolutely think it will. So, we should say that the Green Party in Scotland is separate. It's a separate organisation to the Green Party in England and Wales. So Zach Polanski is not like a UK-wide leader. In Scotland, there's co-leaders. We've got Ross Greer and Gillian Mackay, who both got elected last year. But Gillian Mackay is maybe lesser known by the public. She's a relatively new MSP, whereas Ross Greer has been an MSP for a while. He's apart from Patrick Harvey, the former Scottish Greens leader, Ross Greer is probably the most high-profile Green MSP there is. Like, he's quite a familiar face. He's been on TV and radio for years. He had a sort of famous set piece row with Piers Morgan a few years ago, which definitely boosted his profile. But just to come back, but I think they'll be very, very happy with the way that Zach Polanski is steering the Greens down south, and they'll be hoping that can give them a boost. Because it's kind of an odd thing, really, the difference between the two of them, because the Greens in England, obviously, the way the Westminster voting system works, they've only ever had a handful of MPs. They've been nowhere near power. Whereas with the Scottish voting system for Holyrood, I won't get into the boring details, but the Greens have had a sizable but not massive group of MSPs for a while. And they also, for a few years, were actually in power with the SNP. So way back in the midst of time in 2021, when Nicola Sturgeon was still the SNP leader, when she won that election in 2021, she signed what was called the Butte House Agreement, and it was basically a power sharing agreement between the SNP and the Greens. But what we did see is we saw two Green MSPs actually go into government, in Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater. So they aren't quite the sort of anti-establishment new guys in Scotland. They have been in government. They have shaped policies, quite a few policies, really, maybe not as many as they would like, but they've been around for a while. The voters know who they are in Scotland, whereas obviously in England they are a kind of like new force that maybe voters aren't aware of that much, but are maybe looking at them and thinking, well, I quite like the cut of their jib. Actually, they're saying something different to what Labour and the Conservatives and Reform are doing, and they're reaping the results. So, well, I think it's difficult for the Greens though, because as I said before about it's such a fragmented scene in Scotland. There are so many parties competing for votes. So the Greens are going to have to work very, very hard to kind of make themselves heard. But I do know that in Glasgow, where I stay, the Greens are very strong locally. They have a lot of members, a lot of activists, are very motivated. And I think maybe it would be a stretch for them to win a constituency, because that's really something the Scottish Greens have to do. Because we saw in England, obviously, in places like Gorton now, but in places like Bristol, places like Brighton, the Greens can win constituencies where they haven't done that in Scotland. They've never managed to kind of overhaul both the SNP and Labour in a seat to win. And I think if they're going to progress long term, they need to get over that. They need to be winning. Just an example, like either maybe in Leith in Edinburgh or in the south side of Glasgow, where they have a lot of members. They need to be turning that into a constituency winning machine, because in Scotland you have the list system, where it's basically you put your first X for a constituency candidate, and on the second vote you put an X for party. and that's how the Greens have returned members before, but into MSPs. But I think they need a high-profile by-election when the Scottish Greens. I think that would be a kind of breakthrough moment for them, and I'm sure in time. I don't know in what circumstance scenario, but it'll happen. But for now, I think almost have been overshadowed really by the Greens down south. I think, they're probably looking at what Zach Polanski is doing and thinking, well, how can we replicate that? And I mean, again, this is just like me speculating. I don't think this would necessarily happen in the short term, but the Greens co-leader model, I think maybe in future they'll maybe think we actually just need one leader. We need one figurehead in the way that Zach Polanski is the figurehead for the Greens in England. I think maybe splitting the role maybe allows it to kind of dilute the views of them. I don't know, but remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, it's certainly going to be an interesting few days and weeks ahead with the upcoming Holyrood elections. So it's been great to chat with you, Chris. This is Chris McCall, the deputy political editor at the Daily Record. So where can people follow your work, Chris? Where can people catch up with the latest goings on from your point of view?
So I'm still on Twitter. I know increasingly few people are. My handle is Denny News. I won't give you the backstory for why that is. It's too long and tedious, but I'm also on Blue Sky on the same handle. But if you put my name into Google, you'll find me. And obviously, I want to give a plug for the Planet Holyrood podcast that the Daily Record records every Wednesday. It's usually my colleague Paul Hutchin that hosts it, but we talk about the latest Scottish politics news every week on Planet Holyrood. And if you've not watched it or listened to it on Spotify, I would definitely recommend it.
Yeah, it's a really insightful listen, so definitely worth checking out. So if you have enjoyed this and you want to check out Planet Holyrood, then please do hit subscribe as well on the channel. And Chris, we will catch up with you next time.